All right, everyone. So I think we'll get started and we'll kick off this for me evening, for some of you morning, launch of the Progressing National SDGs Implementation Report. I'm Shannon Kinnernay. I'm the Director of Research, Policy and Practice at the Canadian Council for International Cooperation. And my organization has been working with a coalition of civil society stakeholders from around the world to prepare the Progressing National SDGs Implementation Report for the past 4 years. The first year, the work was carried out by Bond, and then in the following years, 2017 through 2019, a larger coalition of organizations came on to review reporting to the high-level political forum on sustainable development at the United Nations. Now, just a few housekeeping things before we get going. It looks like we're a smaller group today. There are more registered, so we'll see how many others come on. But if you have any questions during the presentation or at the end of the comments on the presentation, please do put them in the chat box, and we will do our best to address the questions at the end. Thank you all for joining us. Following a presentation by myself, we'll then have some comments from a number of stakeholders from different parts of the world. So we have our colleague Thalak Kirawasan from the Sri Lanka Nature Group Sri Lanka, who will give a perspective. Sri Lanka reported in 2018, so it'll be interesting to have a perspective from you know, how things have changed since then. We also have Erna Gambosran, who's with the Center for Human Rights and Development in Mongolia, and Mongolia reported in 2019, and so she'll share with us her perspective around kind of a national perspective in that process. And then finally, we'll also have comments from John Romano, who is the coordinator of the TAP network, who will provide a bit of a perspective around some of the global opportunities related to the accountability, follow-up, and review process of reporting on the Sustainable Development Goals. So without further ado, I think those are all of my housekeeping points and introductions, and I'll just move into sharing with you a bit of the story around this report and what are some of our key findings emerging this year. So as I mentioned, the report is an initiative of a variety of different civil society organizations. I also flag, as we did in this morning's webinar, that, you know, if there's interest in this report, in working with us, please do put it in the chat box, reach out to us. It's an initiative of civil society, and we're always looking to broaden the support and the tent. The report itself reviews all of the voluntary national review reports that were submitted to the United Nations in 2019. And what it does is it provides an overview of pretty much all aspects of 2030 Agenda implementation. So we look at governance and institutions, we look at policies and how the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda more broadly have been incorporated into policies. We look at the means of implementation, so partnerships, leaving no one behind, budgeting, costing, financing, reporting, and so on. Pretty much, if something related to the 2030 Agenda and implementation, it's probably covered by this report. And importantly, we also look at the Secretary General's voluntary common reporting guidelines and try to assess the extent to which member states are reporting against the components in those guidelines every year. Now, the report itself provides sort of the aggregate level findings. We provide the trend data over, you know, the last 4 years for which we have data, but we also really try to tease out what are some of the good practices. And so we use case studies coming from the VNR reports themselves, noting, of course, the limitations. For those of us who have been involved in VNR processes or have read them, we know that that they're not always the evidence in them is not always something that necessarily all stakeholders in the country would agree with. But using that information base that we have, we try to tease out what we think might be some good practices based on the reports. We also identify what we see as best practices. And so those are, you know, emerging practices that seem to be coming out of the VNR reports more generally, and we try to tease out those what we think might be some best practice in implementation. We have a traffic light system that we use to examine the reporting against the Secretary General guidelines. And so in that respect, we, green if the report essentially meets the guideline, yellow if they somewhat met it, and of course red if it's not included. So a very kind of simple way to see how any country is doing in terms of meeting those guidelines. And we also prepare, in addition to the broader report, we prepare an annex of country profiles. And those country profiles provide sort of a very quick 2 to 3 page synopsis of how each country does against our pillars of analysis. And so we see that the report has a lot of value that it can bring to stakeholders. On one hand, it really gives an overview of the current state of play and where we're at in terms of 2030 Agenda implementation. If you're a civil society stakeholder looking for best practices, or a government looking for ideas around how to accelerate implementation, then we point stakeholders in that direction. It's also a useful advocacy tool in that sense, setting the bar, understanding what the standards are in terms of implementation, and then being able to look towards our governments and requesting that they do better. It also provides a basis for thinking about parallel reporting, so analyses of how implementation is unfolding, civil society reporting, following some of the aspects that are included in this report provides a bit of a basis that can be used for even reporting or shadow reporting at the national level. And then finally, as I mentioned, the quick, simple overview profiles are helpful if you just want to get a quick look at where your country might be. Now, in terms of the story that this year's report tells, I think there's some really positive successes, but there's certainly some worrying signs. And in terms of the reporting overall, we've seen signs of improvement. 75% of countries report against all aspects of the Secretary General's voluntary reporting guidelines, which is great as a first sort of basis for as a basis for collecting this information, for comparing, for lessons learning, for sharing best practice and so on. Just providing that information in a consistent way is incredibly helpful. We saw a very significant increase in reporting around leaving no one behind this year in comparison to previous years, up to 81% from 63% last year. But we saw that states continue to, in our view, struggle in terms of reporting on the structural issues and the structural barriers that they face in implementing the agenda. Information tends to not be provided, or not provided in a sufficient way that we would characterize that component as having been met. There were some marginal declines as well in terms of reporting on the methodology for the reviews, which is of course a disappointment when there had been gains in the previous year. But overall, I would say reporting is improving, and we have more of the information that we're looking to have from the VNRs themselves. Leaving no one behind is clearly becoming a defining feature of the 2030 Agenda, and I think it's shown in the reports themselves. 81% of countries reported or provided information on leaving no one behind in 2019, which was an increase. The infographic on your screen shows the types of groups in society that member states reported were at risk of being left behind or being left behind. And so you can see there that 98% is all but one country referred to women, children and youth, and so on. And even within that context of articulating who is at risk of being left behind, we saw a lot of nuance. We saw countries referring to the sort of intersectional pieces. So, migrant children or children with disabilities. And so the intersecting forms of exclusion and discrimination that might cause people to be left behind, that's flagged in certainly in some of the reports. We also noted in the reports this sort of pressing need articulated around the disaggregated data that's needed to leave no one behind. That continues to be a challenge that member states point to. In particular, the most commonly cited forms of disaggregated data that are needed are gender and age, but other, region and so on were also mentioned. And in terms of leaving no one behind, 21% of the countries that reported last year identified that as a challenge, which is a difference in previous years. When we looked at what countries identified as their challenges, it didn't show up in previous years in terms of what was articulated as a key challenge in implementation. And so recognizing that that's the challenge, I think, is a good step. At the same time, we still have the question mark of the extent to which the leaving no one behind agenda is fundamentally changing the way that countries approach 2030 agenda implementation through overarching policies. VNR reports continue to showcase existing initiatives when they talk about leaving no one behind. 36% of reports noted that leaving no one behind or efforts to address inequality and social exclusion are part of their overarching development plans. And there's certainly not far enough, and there's room for more progress there. And certainly room for member states to articulate what they are doing differently in light of the leaving no one behind agenda. In terms of the whole of society approach, the ambition of this agenda to bring a diverse range of stakeholders to play in leaving no one behind and realizing the goals. One of the things that we have certainly concluded is that the inclusion of non-state actors in the governance arrangements or the institutional arrangements for implementing the 2030 agenda is standard practice. I think it will be increasingly difficult for countries to justify not including non-state actors when you have 70% of countries over essentially the past 4 years indicating that they have in some way included non-state actors. And the ones that are the most often included certainly are academia, civil society, and private sector, but we still also see references to other groups, trade unions, local governments, youth, and so on. And so that's a positive trend. On the other hand, 2019 saw an increasing focus on that inclusion in the form of technical working groups. So those working groups that governments are putting together to look at maybe data, to look at different thematics in the SDGs, that's the level at which there was an emphasis on including non-state actors this year versus engagement in the higher level kind of broader strategic councils or committees that countries are developing. And so that was, so while there was sort of an increase overall and a continued positive trend in terms of including non-state actors, we noted the worrisome trend of including them not at necessarily the higher level in terms of institutional arrangements and governance. But of course, governance and institutional arrangements are not sufficient, at least certainly in my view, when we think about what stakeholder engagement should entail. And there needs to be opportunities beyond the select few that get to participate in those moments for broader stakeholder engagement. And so one of the things we tracked last year and this year was whether countries reported that they had developed formal processes for stakeholder engagement. And so we saw an increase in countries flagging that they had indeed done this in 2019 at 60% over 39% in 2018. We saw an increase in countries reporting that they had included directly non-state actors in the drafting of their voluntary national review reports. So whether that would be in the form of committees or drafting teams, or actually providing the content, dedicated chapters written by non-state actors, and so on. And so we saw an increase in 2019 in that space over 2018. I would say even with 60% of the countries referring to some kind of formal process, the formal processes themselves are not necessarily, let's say, widespread. So a few countries, a handful of countries referred to engagement strategies that had been developed or partnership strategies. Some referred to annual events, others referred to youth councils. So I mean, there's sort of an emergence of different ways of engaging stakeholders, certainly, but they're not necessarily across the board. And in that respect, the quality of engagement still matters. And we consistently hear this from civil society organizations and others that, that engagement is not necessarily open and accessible. There lacks sometimes transparency around what engagement is for, adequate timelines to sufficiently prepare and engage. All of these sort of pieces that we've identified as quality aspects of engagement, VNR reports don't necessarily provide us with insights on that. And so that's definitely an area where I think reporting could be improved and where we continue to note that it is important in the 2030 agenda implementation. Now, in terms of partnerships, or looking at the role or the contributions that non-state actors play in implementation of the 2030 agenda, we noted this year that a lot of the reports included at least information on at least one stakeholder outside of government and the role that they're playing. Most often it was more than that. So you would have examples of maybe from academia, civil society, local government, and so on. But all countries did include at least one example of a non-state actor's contribution to the agenda. And in that respect, kind of there's a transitioning, or I think we are transitioning to more national reports, not government reports, but reports that showcase a broader national effort. We saw at the same time, while all countries referred to these roles, or most countries did, that, and civil society saw increases in terms of references to their role, we saw decreases in the roles of reporting on the roles of parliamentarians, academia, and the private sector. Particularly concerning, in my view, the decreasing on the role, reporting on the role of parliamentarians, particularly around the accountability side of this agenda, which I'll come back to when I talk a bit about the follow-up and review process. And in this context of a whole of society approach, an emphasis on leaving no one behind, or a greater emphasis on leaving no one behind, inclusion in governance, inclusion, formal processes of stakeholder engagement being articulated, recognition of partners, and so on, the VNR reports themselves ignore closing civic space. They don't talk about, attacks on human rights defenders, on environmentalists, even countries that you would presume it might be allies, and would talk about their support for civic space and for, supporting human rights around the world and that kind of thing, do not really take up this issue. And so we, in some ways, what we see is a reporting of a picture that's not quite complete. A lot of emphasizing things that are being done to engage, but maybe not so much a recognition of how the space for engagement is closing around the world. Now, in terms of the actual policies, data, monitoring and evaluation, and so on for implementation, this year's report showed that, and as we had seen in previous years, that countries by and large have integrated the SDGs into their national policies, or at least report that they've done that. And that integration is informed in some way by a mapping of either policies, of available data, or policies and data. Unlike last year, where most reports, the majority of reports talked about having reviewed both policy and data, this year reports tended to focus on the mapping around policies, and the policy mapping informing their integration of the SDGs into policy frameworks. At the same time, I wonder, this is I don't know for sure because we're only looking at the data and the reports, but the more limited reference to data might also be explained by the fact that more countries this year actually provided information on data availability than in previous years. So the majority of countries actually articulated in some way the level of data that was available for 2030 to monitor their efforts towards 2030 agenda implementation. But at the same time, when we then look at the broader aspects of the 2030 agenda, so moving beyond the SDGs to look at the transformative elements, the universal nature of the agenda, planetary boundaries, intergenerational responsibility, and so on, we see that countries essentially refer, for the most part, to leaving no one behind, but do not sufficiently refer to a human rights-based approach, to intergenerational responsibility, and other aspects or transformative aspects of the agenda, which raises questions, raises the question of whether member states continue to focus on the SDGs broadly, rather than kind of the preamble and the broader, more transformative aspects of this agenda. We also noted that in the VNR reporting themselves, countries do not consistently emphasize all aspects of sustainable development. And so you see countries, tending to have some having heavier emphasis or less of an emphasis on any one of the dimensions of sustainable development. And this year we found the bias was more towards social issues for countries that didn't report equally or cover equally all aspects of sustainable development. In terms of the means of implementation, 2019 saw a greater emphasis or reporting on the inclusion of the SDGs or the 2030 agenda into budgeting processes. So this refers to where countries said that they've either already started to budget against the SDGs, or they were planning to do so, or in the process of implementing a process that would include the SDGs in their budgeting processes, with 64% of countries making that kind of reference. And at the same time, while countries will say what sources of finance they will use to implement the 2030 agenda, so talking about private and public, both international and domestic sources of finance, innovative finance, ODA, these kinds of things. They'll talk about having identified the sources of finance. They'll also say that finance and resource mobilization is the most commonly cited challenge to 2030 agenda implementation. They have not actually costed out implementation. So on one hand, we don't know what it will cost, but on the other hand, we know that getting more finance and resources is one of the biggest challenges we have. And so we flagged that as sort of a bit of a contradiction or an issue in this year's report. Now, in terms of reporting on means of implementation, other aspects, we did see declines in reporting on international public finance, trade, and systemic issues this year over last year. Just concerning, considering that this is certainly the global partnership dimension of this agenda, sort of carries with it the legacy of failures around MDG 8. And so we certainly want to see member states reporting on these dimensions and demonstrating what their priorities and needs are, as well as where progress has been made. But the other is also thinking about the learning and the peer exchange element of the VNRs and what they're meant to do in informing learning at the high-level political forum. While countries do report around the challenges that they face, and increasingly reporting around those challenges, we would argue that there's still insufficient reporting around peer learning, around kind of best practices, and around things that have been lessons learned in implementation, and that reporting on those dimensions is very critical to the kind of learning and peer exchange orientation of the HLPF. Finally, this year's reports showed an increase in actually reporting or referring to follow-up and review processes at the national level. So in some way, they met the requirement of having reported on that, but they tend to lack reference to when reporting will occur, to who reporting will occur, and how and by whom. And importantly for us, and back to my point earlier about the role of parliamentarians, only 5 countries noted the involvement of parliamentarians in their follow-up and review process. And so really raising some questions around accountability in implementation and the role of the formally elected officials in ensuring accountability for progress. And the final point before I close is just to note that the VNR reports also did not refer to the role of global follow-up and review processes and how that might fit in relation to national reporting, as well as regional opportunities, which is of course timely as the Africa Regional Forum is happening this week. And so not referring to the role of those moments and those processes in follow-up and review. So that's it for the formal presentation of the findings of the report. And I'd now like to turn it over to our colleagues to offer some of their reflections from a national perspective, and certainly in hearing the points that I've raised from the key findings of the report. So I'll first turn to you, Erna. As I mentioned, Mongolia presented for the first time in 2019. And so it would be really great to hear, from your perspective, the government's approach to stakeholder engagement and implementation overall. What kind of successes and challenges do you see?
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Hello. Good. So this is actually a very good opportunity, and I have chance also to learn. So yes, the Mongolia had the VNR report last year, presented at high-level political forum, and the CSOs were very active in this process. And I think that the government was actually very open to different stakeholders. And I say it based on CSO experience because the CSOs were very active. They expressed their interest to contribute in the government in this voluntary national review process. And the government accepted it, and it involved in the National Working Group on preparation for VNR report. And also the CSOs made a presentation of CSO report to the government experts group for drafting of voluntary national review report. And also it presented to the National Working Group themselves. So that's and I think that the very issues were raised by civil society report were reflected in the final report. And so that's our task actually was fulfilled, CSO's task, because we wanted that the report was objective and it included the real fact, But at the same time, we didn't really observe the same initiative from the business sector. And I think that the reason was mainly because that for private sector, it wasn't much interesting to engage with the government on SDG issues. So this is even though there was a representative included in the National Working Group on preparation for voluntary national report, and then also the private sector was also invited in the national consultation on discussion of a draft voluntary national review report. But I think that again, and then the main reason is that we don't really have this formal, institutionalized, multi-stakeholder consultation mechanism on SDGs. So this is, I think, that the main reason. And then also there is not fully reflected SDG goals and targets in our national policies and in our national government program, and also in every year social and economic directions. So that's the reason, I think. And then also since we don't have this multi-stakeholder consultation mechanism, so we have many breaches between the sectoral policies and between the national and local development policies, and even within sector policies as well. So I think that the very first thing for us is that for civil society organizations is that we need really to raise public awareness on urgent need to establish this functional, regular functioning multi-stakeholder consultation mechanism on development policies. And now we, Mongolian civil society organizations, network of CSOs on SDGs, is trying to advocate to establish this functional mechanism. So this is what we are now doing. What is the success? I think that the civil society organizations organized themselves in a network, and it also produced a joint report on SDGs, and it also made a way the government at national and at ministerial level, and also at local level in some provinces and zones. And also the most important thing is that the CSOs are very keen to continue this report writing annually and assess the progress, if any, or maybe even regress if there is. And then the challenge, of course, is that the CSO participation is not fully ensured, and CSO's knowledge, experience, and voluntary work is not mobilized or not utilized by the government for implementation of SDGs, and there is no mechanism for regular participation of CSO. So this is what we have now. So thank you.
Great, thank you for sharing that with us. So I'd like to turn to Thalak to talk a bit about the Sri Lankan experience after reporting in 2018. What kind of progress have you seen since then? How do you find this year's findings that we've shared with you this year? How does that compare to your experiences?
Thank you for this opportunity to talk about this, the VNR, the success or the failures of the country level experience. Especially there is the talk will focus on to the three different aspects of the pre VNR situation and the VNR period, and also the post VNR the period. Especially the kind of pre VNRs the period is very good, because the 2015 we had a new government. During that new government, they have established a separate ministry for sustainable development. It was a kind of a that was created because of there was a pressure from the civil society to look at not just as in environment and other different the aspects. We were asking from that government, the particular government, to look at holistic approach, and that is why they were created a ministry called Sustainable Development and Wildlife. They were put together with that. Anyway, it was kind of a hearing to the civil society, and they were going forward from beginning. But in the 2017, when it came from the 2017, there was a Sustainable Development Act from the government was passed, which was based all the concerns from the government institutions, the CSOs and all that. It was a kind of a very good background to when the VNR was came up, when the government was pledged. This the country's willingness to participate to the VNR, and then they have put up a task force. That task force was the particular government institution was given the task to coordinate this, and that institution was not very well aware what should be the multi-stakeholder task force. But they only got some of the UN agencies, some of the government agencies, and the Chamber of Commerce, without any CSO participation to the task force. What they have done to prepare this report, VNR report, they have put up a consultancy agency to map it out and make kind of a they have given a task to prepare a report. The process of the preparing the report was agreeable, and they had a few the discussions, especially with when we ask, we want to, the civil society has came up with a multi-stakeholder platform, and we were asked from the government, if you all are doing this VNR report, there should be active participation from the CSOs. Therefore, we CSOs have become another collective of together with the business groups, academias, and all that. We have formed multi-stakeholder platform to the SDG, and we have we had a kind of a discussions with the people who were appointed as the task force, and then they have heard to us, and they included some of our concerns, and then the process was started with the few consultations. But the consultations, during the consultation, there are no proper the system to get concern from the grassroots level. Only the government the concerns were highlighted, and then we came up with the kind of our concerns with differently. We have prepared the preliminary report as a civil society, the platform. The 2008 somehow with some concerns the report was finished and submitted, but the afterward there are no the follow-up or any kind of activities afterward. This due to some reasons, because when we had the July high-level political forum, and then October the particular government was chased out because because of the political the stability, there were some problem, and then this CSO concerns were totally ignored, and the new government was against to the CSOs because they were nationalistic agenda. They thought it can be disparities with their political the heading on. Finally they have understood, and finally they have take up as the CSOs as a threat to their political the kind of activities. Still there is unrest, kind of unrest with the situation. Totally the SDG, not only SDG, other the work with the CSOs was kind of a disable. When it comes to the SDG process, our CSO engagement, we continue our concerns, and every 3 months we are meeting as this stakeholder CSO stakeholder platform, and we are pressurizing to the UN agencies and also the government agencies to look at the different situation, because as a country we are facing kind of difficulties because we have a huge debt. This situation, the achieving SDG goals are very difficult because of we have a lot of paybacks, and to pay back the loan we have to take another loans, and in this situation you can't talk about the kind of the sustainable development. When it comes to the last part, the political stability is very important to have the taking up the SDG things. When you have the government who are not understanding with the multi-stakeholder participation and the importance of the work, their work, and it is also as Urna said, some of the government officials also not understanding what is CSO's importance. There should be some kind of a lead agency and also the coordinating body. The UN can play the bigger role of this kind of situation. That is not happening even in the country what we have seen, because they just thinking to coordinate with the government to bring them into the system, but if they are not having a proper coordination, it is very difficult. But finally, the open, transparent, informed, the system was not in what I can say. That was not a practice during the whole thing. But in a pressure of the CSOs and other groups, it somehow became a kind of a good move. The report was finally included our concerns, but afterward the post VNR situation is very bad. It is not going as we expected, and also it is the government also not considering as CSOs and other stakeholders as key players of this SDG whole exercise. Thank you.
Thank you for that intervention, and really interesting to hear the kind of the transition in a negative way and an unfortunate way from the national perspective. John, I'll turn to you now to maybe take us to the opportunities you see for improvements at the global and national level in terms of the follow-up and review processes.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, I mean, where do we start in terms of where some of the challenges may lie? I mean, we've heard about some of them from some of these national experiences, and obviously some insights from the report. But I think there's a lot to be discussed in the context of the follow-up and review process in general. So, the process through the HLPF or through engaging through the regional coordination and through the regional HLPFs. I think some of the reflections that we've seen, over the past 4 years in this first cycle of reporting, is that I think member states very much see this the VNR process and the VNR presentations at the HLPF as a little bit of kind of a show. I think I think they see it as an opportunity to showcase, maybe some of the good things that are happening in their country in particular, and maybe not be so frank with how they're facing some challenges or shortcomings in progress. And I think that's partially due to kind of thinking about what are the incentives for presenting the VNR report at the global level. I think there's this tendency to want to show the good things, obviously, but also there's a challenge of time as well at the HLPF. There's only a few days allocated for the VNRs, and that whole process at the HLPF every year. And I think it's very much an open question on it. Is that good enough? And I think from our experiences over the past few years, I would say no. We have, 15 minutes for VNR presentations, and then very, very few, a few opportunities for actual engagement and questions and challenges to some of these presentations, and where we have seen interaction and questions, so different member states or stakeholders questioning, some of the contents of the report. They've been, these interventions have been pre-scheduled. So we have colleagues that are kind of asking questions, not necessarily in a really organic manner, which I think is a big challenge for us. There are many, many other challenges when it comes to the global processes, which we really hope will be addressed during the HLPF review negotiations. So going forward, member states will negotiate on what the HLPF looks like. Again, we're hopeful that there's this recognition that the system needs to change, and that the HLPF needs to be a better opportunity for having a really honest conversation about some of the shortcomings, in particular, where there's a lack of progress in particular countries. And it's not to say that the HLPF will be an opportunity for naming and shaming countries necessarily if they have a genuine lack of progress in a particular area. It's around, if a country is facing a particular challenge, maybe there's a country that has similar experiences and they've overcome some of these challenges. It should be seen as an opportunity for really enhancing, some of the commitments and the action that's taken from the HLPF and from the VNR report. And so that leads me to my second point, is that I think, the VNRs in particular, through the reports and the presentation and some of these discussions through the follow-up and review process, I think really needs to have a focus on the post-VNR aspect of things. So a lot of the reporting focuses on what's been done up to that point and through the first cycle of the HLPF. I think that's fairly understandable. But now that we've gone through this first cycle and we've taken stock, and we have a huge amount of countries that have actually taken stock and presented their VNR reports in this first cycle, I think it's really important for us to push governments to make sure that going forward in their future VNRs, that they're that they're being honest with the challenges. Again, we need to identify the areas where we are lacking in progress in order to actually then address some of those issues. But I think it's important for us to have governments make explicit commitments on what they're going to do to address some of these challenges. And we're happy to see also that the Secretary General's voluntary reporting guidelines that have just been revised have that recognition of governments needing to make more commitments on what they're doing going forward. Whether it's in regards to financing or policy integration, or just drawing a link to their past VNR, what progress has been made since that previous VNR, and what are their plans between now and when they report the next time. This is also really important for us as civil society because, the more concrete we can get governments to be on their commitments through this VNR report, the easier it is for us to hold them accountable to these commitments. And look back and say, have you achieved what you set out to achieve a few years ago when you reported the last time? And so finally, somewhat related to that, and we've heard a little bit here as well about the value of spotlight reporting. So these civil society spotlight reports, independent reports from, especially from partnerships and coalitions of civil society in particular countries, I think is hugely important. I think there's a lot to be said about, the creating entry points for ourselves throughout these processes. And I think what we've learned from the past few years is that in the cases where these spotlight reports have been put together, it's a lot easier to come to a government and say, look, here are our consolidated thoughts. Here is what we're thinking in terms of what needs to happen next. And I think oftentimes, especially if these spotlight reports are done in a really robust way and in a proactive and kind of positive way, I think governments are a lot more receptive, particularly because the work has already been done by civil society to kind of coordinate some of these joint perspectives through the report. So I think much more needs to be done to encourage better spotlight reporting and more coordinated spotlight reporting in countries. And then, of course, promote the role of these spotlight reports in the follow-up and review process, because currently the follow-up and review process through the HLPF, all it is an opportunity for countries to present VNR reports, but I think it would also be great for us to have an opportunity and an entry point for civil society to present these spotlight reports through the VNR process as well, so we can get a little bit of a perspective from government and from civil society, and then we can collectively come together and say, you know, if there are differences in, you know, what the VNR report is telling us from the spotlight report, where are those differences and how can we kind of overcome and come together to, you know, maybe make progress where, you know, progress may be lacking. So again, those are just a few thoughts on the overall follow-up and review process. There's a lot more reflections to it, but I look forward to reading the report and unpacking that a bit further as well.
Great. Thank you so much for that, John. Really appreciated. Now, we only had 5 more minutes planned for this time together, and I don't see any questions in the chat box. We are a small enough group. If anybody wanted to raise their hand, they could do so, and I can give you the floor. And seeing no one, oh, I have someone who's raised their hand. Please go ahead, Stefan.
Hello. Hi, everyone. This is actually Erin. I'm using a different computer, so that's why the name is different. I just have a question to Orna. You mentioned about joint CSO report on SDGs that you produce annually through the network of Mongolian CSOs that's basically engaged in the VNR process. So I was just wondering, in terms of how this report is also used, or whether inputs from that joint report are actually integrated in the overall national Mongolian report on the status of their SDGs.
Organize themselves into CSO's network on SDGs, and it's produced a joint report on SDGs last year to contribute in the government report. And this report was presented to the experts group who was actually drafting the government report. And it was also presented to the National Working Group on preparation for SDGs. So that the main issues which were raised in this CSO report was reflected in the government report. So that's why we were happy that the government report is not really, you know, this kind of success story report, you know, but it was reflecting all the challenges we have now in Mongolia. Yeah, so this is, and now we want to continue this, you know, this process. Yeah. So this is just one. Yeah, this is started just last year, since Mongolia was doing the, the last year VNR at HLPF, and the report, CSO report drafting process started in end of 2018, and it was completed in February of 2019, and it was presented to the experts group. Yeah. And then we were involved in the national consultation on government draft report on VNR, so that we were able to see how the issues were reflected, you know, in the government report.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Oh, I see another hand up. This will be the last question, I think, before our time will come to an end, but I'll turn it over to you, Grace.
So do you have any plans for a follow-up webinar to tonight?
So we had a webinar this morning, well, my time this morning, and we hadn't planned another webinar, particularly on the report. Everything's available online, and the report will be made available through the website and the link that I shared with everybody. Next week in New York, we will do a meeting with member states specifically to share the findings of the report. And already at the various regional forums that are happening this year, a number of the members of this coalition have been sharing the findings of the report already at the Africa regional meetings, and they will be shared throughout the next opportunities coming up. So there will be more in-person moments, if you will, in the lead up to the high-level political forum this year, and likely we'll do another presentation or moment related to the high-level political forum itself.
Okay, thank you. We have 20 of us going to Commission on the Status of Women, so we'll follow up there.
Okay, well, thank you very much to you all. I very much appreciate the comments from our speakers, to our friends and partners at IISD for hosting and helping to set up the webinar, and the rest of the civil society partners that are part of this report. So thank you all, and have a great evening or rest of your day as it might be.
Thank you.
Bye.